It started with something as routine as checking the water pressure. I noticed it one morning. The taps were barely flowing, the garden hose sputtered out air, and the familiar gurgle of my well pump was strangely silent. At first, I thought it was a mechanical fault. Maybe the pump burned out, or a pipe had cracked underground. But nothing prepared me for what I found. My private well, the very source of water for my home and land, was no longer functioning. I opened the access cap, and instead of the echo of deep water or the scent of damp earth, I found solid resistance. Cold, gray, concrete. Someone had filled my well with concrete. I froze. My mind ran through 100 possibilities, but none of them made sense until I saw the small, smug sign planted near the wellhead. It was the HOA's logo, printed in shiny blue and gold, with a brief notice attached underneath in a plastic sleeve. It read something like unapproved structure removed for community compliance. They had labeled my well, the same well that had been registered on my property deed, surveyed, and used legally for years, as an unapproved structure. I couldn't believe what I was reading. This wasn't a code violation. This wasn't a warning. This was deliberate destruction. The HOA didn't just cross a line. They poured concrete over it. They trespassed onto my private property. They tampered with a vital utility. They rendered an entire water system useless with absolutely no prior notification, no legal documentation, and no attempt to resolve the situation diplomatically. Who does that? Who gives themselves that kind of power? I checked my security cameras and found grainy footage of a contractor working late the previous evening. No name, no markings on the truck. Just an anonymous hired hand following HOA orders to destroy something he probably didn't even understand. This wasn't some makeshift project. It was a deep, professionally drilled, legally permitted water source used for drinking, irrigation, and emergency backup. It was built long before the HOA even existed. My great-uncle oversaw its construction. We maintained it diligently, upgraded it over the years, and never once received any complaints. But the HOA board had changed recently. New faces with new visions for the neighborhood. They started cracking down on things they called unregulated utilities, and apparently my well was next on their list. When I tried to reach someone from the board, I was stonewalled. I called. No answer. I emailed. Nothing. I even visited the office, only to be told that the matter had been closed. Closed? I hadn't even had a chance to speak before they filled my well with concrete. That's when it hit me. This wasn't just an oversight or an error in paperwork. This was intentional. A message, maybe, or a demonstration of power. I'd heard whispers from other neighbors that the new HOA president was on a crusade to modernize the community, and anyone who didn't fit that vision was in her crosshairs. I walked around the site, numb with disbelief. The concrete was still fresh in places, with flecks of dry mix clinging to the outer rim of the casing. I crouched down and scraped some of it with a stick, revealing just how deep they had gone. They didn't just seal the top. They had filled it all the way down, tens of feet, completely unusable. A resource that had provided clean, mineral-rich water for decades, gone overnight. And no one had said a word. I began documenting everything. Photos, videos, measurements, timestamps. I pulled out my property survey and highlighted every reference to the well's existence. I made copies of the well permit, the installation paperwork, and water testing reports from the last 10 years. If they thought they could bury my rights under a few tons of cement, they were going to find out just how wrong they were. I didn't care how many board members signed off on it. I didn't care how many bylaws they twisted. They had crossed into criminal territory, and I was going to hold them accountable. The worst part was knowing this wasn't just about water. It was about control. They believed they could take what they wanted, erase what they didn't like, and silence anyone who pushed back. But this well wasn't just a water source. It was a legacy, a right, a symbol of independence they couldn't stand. That's why they targeted it. That's why they tried to destroy it without warning. Because it reminded them that some of us still believed in living without their constant interference. The HOA's excuse was wrapped in glossy language. They said the well disrupted the visual harmony of the community. According to them, the old metal pump housing and exposed piping clashed with the updated landscaping standards of the neighborhood. They called it an eyesore, something that didn't align with their revised community aesthetics policy. But what they really meant was that they didn't like anything that reminded them this neighborhood was once rural, practical, and privately maintained. Their polished vision didn't include functional structures that didn't fit the cookie-cutter mold they were trying to force on everyone. It wasn't about safety. It wasn't about sanitation. It wasn't even about code. The well was properly enclosed, shielded with a small wooden fence, and far from any walking paths or shared property lines. It had passed every inspection since the day it was drilled, and I had the documentation to prove it. There had never been a complaint, not once. But suddenly, with a new HOA board in power and a president obsessed with rebranding the neighborhood, my well became enemy number one. I found out later that they had quietly amended the neighborhood guidelines just months before the incident. Hidden deep in a 40-page update was a vague clause about unapproved utility fixtures impacting visual consistency. It didn't name wells specifically. It didn't explain the process for appeal or approval. It simply gave the board discretionary power to deem something visually disruptive and demand its removal. And if the homeowner failed to act within a certain period, the HOA could take corrective action at their own discretion. What made it worse was how selectively they enforced this rule. There were several properties nearby with external AC units, visible irrigation systems, or propane tanks. None of them were flagged. None of them were removed. The only difference? Those homeowners were part of the board's inner circle. People who nodded along at meetings, showed up to social events, and kept their criticisms to themselves. Meanwhile, I had been vocal. I had pushed back on unnecessary dues increases, opposed the new surveillance cameras at the entrances, and once submitted a petition against using HOA funds for a luxury clubhouse renovation. I wasn't popular with the new leadership, and I had a feeling that fact weighed heavily in their so-called aesthetic decision. The more I dug, the more it became clear that this was personal. They weren't managing a community. They were running a social club with enforcement powers. They liked compliance, but more than that, they liked control. Anything that didn't match their carefully curated vision became a threat, and I had the misfortune of owning one of the few properties that had held onto its character and function. My well wasn't just a well to them. It was a symbol of nonconformity, of independence, of something they couldn't control through a fine or a rule book. I reviewed the official letter they sent, buried in a monthly newsletter that most people probably tossed without reading. It wasn't addressed to me personally. It didn't provide specific instructions or a timeline. It simply said, in vague language, that structures affecting visual cohesion would be handled if homeowners failed to respond to prior notifications. Notifications I never received. I checked my mail. I checked my email inbox. I even went through the HOA's member portal online. Nothing. No warning. No request. No hearing. Just a single line in a newsletter followed by unannounced destruction. I confronted one of the board members during a community event. I asked why they hadn't sent a formal notice, why I wasn't given a chance to respond. His answer? We assumed you knew the rules. That was the moment I realized how emboldened they had become. They didn't feel obligated to explain their actions. They believed the rules gave them blanket authority. And worse, they had started to interpret those rules however it suited them. Their decision had nothing to do with aesthetics. The well was out of sight from the road. It didn't interfere with the landscaping. It wasn't visible from neighboring properties, but it stood as a quiet reminder that some of us still valued utility over polish, function over form, substance over appearance. That's what they couldn't stand, something useful, lawful, and traditional existing outside of their pristine, artificial vision. So they buried it literally under several feet of concrete. I wasn't alone in facing this kind of selective enforcement. After word got out about what happened to my well, other neighbors began to speak up. Stories of unfair citations, surprise inspections, and pressure to remodel perfectly functional parts of their homes all started surfacing. The HOA was acting like a private regime, issuing edicts instead of communicating, enforcing silence instead of encouraging dialogue. And my well, once just a quiet, reliable part of my land, had become the latest casualty in their crusade against individuality. The well wasn't just a source of water. It was a cornerstone of my family's history. Drilled by my grandfather in the early 1970s, it was one of the first improvements made to this property when it was still surrounded by farmland instead of manicured lawns and gated entries. Back then, the nearest municipal water line was miles away, and having a private well wasn't just a convenience, it was survival. That well drew clean, mineral-rich water straight from the aquifer. Over the years, it became more than a utility. It was a testament to self-sufficiency, a link between past and present, and a vital part of daily life on the land my family worked hard to preserve. When I moved back to the property, it was one of the first things I checked. It still worked like a charm. The pump had been replaced a few times, the cover had been upgraded, and we even added a filtration system to ensure it met all modern standards. I kept every maintenance receipt, every lab test showing the water's purity, every invoice for inspections. It was all documented. Everything about it was by the book, compliant, maintained, and fully integrated into my property's infrastructure. There is never a reason to question its legitimacy or usefulness. It stood in a quiet corner of the yard, doing its job without fanfare. The HOA, on the other hand, was a relatively recent arrival. When the housing development expanded, the surrounding farmland was bought out by developers, and the land that had been in families for generations was suddenly absorbed into a uniform community plan. The original homeowners, like me, were grandfathered in under existing property agreements, which included the right to maintain pre-existing utilities. The HOA was not supposed to have jurisdiction over anything installed before their establishment, especially not utilities that predated the association itself. That legal detail, however, seemed to be ignored when it no longer served their goals. Their claim was that all properties within the boundary, regardless of original agreements, were now subject to modern community standards. According to their rewritten documents, those standards did not include private water systems, even if those systems were historically present and fully legal. But when I brought this up at a board meeting months before the incident, I was brushed off. They said it was under review and that I would be contacted with updates. No updates ever came. What came instead was concrete. Seeing that well destroyed, filled in as if it were nothing more than a hole in the ground, was infuriating. But what struck even deeper was the emotional loss. That well wasn't just a mechanical component of my home. It was something my family had built, repaired, relied on, and protected for decades. My father taught me how to clean the filter. My mother watered her garden with its supply. I remember drawing water with a metal pail as a child, hearing the echo as it descended into the darkness below. It had survived storms, droughts, and system failures. Not once had it failed us until the HOA decided it didn't fit. The sheer effort it took to fill that well with concrete was deliberate. It wasn't a mistake. It wasn't patchwork. Someone had brought in equipment, poured heavy material down into the shaft, and sealed it with the kind of finality that said they didn't expect it to ever be reopened. That's not how you correct a violation. That's how you erase history. The board had made a calculated decision to remove something they saw as a blemish on their vision of uniformity, and they did it knowing full well what it meant to me and my property. They couldn't claim ignorance. The well was marked on the original plats. It was clearly visible during neighborhood tours, and it was mentioned repeatedly in public meetings. When I contacted the water department, they confirmed that the well had a valid registration on file. It had never been cited, never red flagged. It was still, in the eyes of the county, an active and authorized source of water. But to the HOA, legality wasn't enough. They wanted everything to look the same, operate the same, and be under their control. The idea that someone had a functioning water source, completely independent of their oversight, likely made them nervous. They weren't interested in tradition, heritage, or function. They were interested in optics. A neat little row of homes with municipal hookups and no reminders of what came before their bylaws took over. That well represented more than water. It stood for autonomy, resilience, and history. It was a living piece of the land story, something no committee could rewrite with a new regulation. And now it was gone, desecrated by people who neither understood nor respected its value. They didn't just destroy a utility, they destroyed a legacy. The moment I realized what had happened to my well, I knew I couldn't afford to wait. I wasn't going to let them get away with this. I grabbed my phone and started making calls, not to the HOA, who had already shown their disregard for communication or accountability, but to people with real authority. The first call was to the county environmental office. I explained the situation, gave them the well registration number, and forwarded photos of the concrete-filled casing. They were stunned. The inspector I spoke with confirmed that any tampering with a registered private water supply, especially without the owner's consent, was a serious violation. He requested a formal statement and assured me that an investigation would be opened immediately. That was just the beginning. My next call was to the State Utility Regulatory Commission. These were the people who oversaw water rights, usage permits, and utility conflicts in residential zones. I explained the incident in full detail, providing documentation that my well was a legally established utility that had been in continuous operation for decades. I emailed them the original permit, copies of water quality tests, and proof that it had never been flagged for any violations. Within the hour, a case was opened. They told me they had never dealt with an HOA physically destroying a water source before, and that the consequences could be severe depending on the results of their inquiry. I wasn't done. I contacted the state health department, who handles rural water safety, and even called the Department of Natural Resources, since the water table serving my well was part of a protected aquifer zone. Every official I spoke with echoed the same reaction: shock. They couldn't believe an organization like an HOA had the nerve to carry out such an action without any legal authority or due process. Several of them pointed out that this could easily fall under criminal property damage or environmental tampering and advised me to file a police report. That's exactly what I did next. I drove down to the local sheriff's office with a folder full of paperwork. The deputy who took my report listened carefully as I laid out everything that had happened: the absence of notice, the unauthorized entry onto my land, the destruction of a registered utility. He took my statement seriously. The report was filed as criminal mischief and potential unlawful destruction of utility property. He assured me someone from their property crimes unit would follow up once they reviewed the documents and contacted the agencies I'd already alerted. Within 48 hours, the case had escalated. County inspectors visited the site and verified everything. They took samples from the well casing, examined the concrete fill, and confirmed that the structure had been tampered with deliberately and without any authorization from local or state authorities. The evidence was indisputable. The HOA had no legal grounds. Their excuse about aesthetic disruption held no weight under state utility laws, and their failure to provide notice made it even worse. Meanwhile, I started reaching out to attorneys specializing in property law and HOA litigation. I needed to know exactly what my rights were and how far I could push back. I wasn't looking for a payout. I was looking for justice and restoration. The lawyer I chose had dealt with rogue HOA cases before and was immediately interested. He told me the HOA had potentially exposed themselves to multiple legal liabilities: trespassing, destruction of private property, interference with utility services, and environmental harm. He also informed me that because the well was a primary water source, the HOA's actions could fall under violations of health and safety regulations that carried serious penalties. The community began to notice what was happening. Word spread quickly. Neighbors who had never spoken up before started telling their own stories about surveillance cameras being installed without consent, about fines issued for minor infractions, about other property modifications the HOA had reversed or removed without explanation. My case lit a spark. It showed people that the board's reach had gone too far, that they were operating more like a private enforcement agency than a representative body of homeowners. I filed official complaints with every agency that would take them. I provided statements, footage, written records, and email exchanges, or the lack thereof. I showed how my well had been targeted, how no alternative water source had been provided, how the board never once attempted a civil resolution. The agencies responded quickly, especially once the inspection reports came in. Their legal departments were now aware. Their enforcement arms had opened files. And now the HOA was under investigation from multiple directions. It only took a few hours for the consequences to catch up with the HOA. Once the regulatory wheels began to turn, the pressure on them mounted fast. I had made my calls, filed my complaints, submitted my documentation, and now all I had to do was wait. But it didn't take long. Less than 24 hours after the first agency visit, the HOA received an official notice from the county. It was a cease and desist order, barring them from tampering with any utility, public or private, until further investigation was complete. That notice alone sent their board members into panic mode, but I wasn't finished. The next call I made would flip their carefully controlled world upside down. I called the Regional Water Authority's Emergency Operations Desk. I explained the situation, not just the destruction of my well, but the possibility that the HOA had carried out similar unauthorized actions elsewhere in the community. I provided the case number from the health department, the environmental violation report, and the cease and desist from the county. The representative on the other end of the line paused and said, "If what you're saying is verified, this affects shared water distribution. We're going to have to shut down access until this is sorted." They weren't just talking about my property. They were talking about the entire HOA's managed water access, everything tied into the local municipal supply that the HOA oversaw through private agreements with the utility provider. The fountains at the clubhouse, the pool, the irrigation systems for the community green spaces, even the decorative ponds in the gated roundabouts. All of it was fed through a secondary system managed under the HOA's name. The Water Authority had full discretion to freeze those services if any part of their agreement violated regional laws or posed a risk to utility infrastructure. By that evening, enforcement officers were on site, inspecting connection points and checking for unauthorized modifications. The HOA had hired private landscapers over the years, and it became clear that those contractors had been making changes to water lines and fixtures without properly notifying the county or the utility provider. They found spliced lines, undocumented pumps, and redirection valves that were never part of the approved plans. All of it added up. The HOA hadn't just poured concrete in my well. They had been playing games with water infrastructure for months, maybe years, and now the entire system was under review. The final call wasn't mine. It came directly from the regional utility supervisor to the HOA president. A mandatory shutdown of their supplemental water access was issued pending further investigation. Within 2 hours, the clubhouse's decorative fountains stopped flowing. By the next morning, the pool was roped off and labeled closed due to maintenance. The lush entry landscaping started to show signs of dryness. Lawns began to brown. Irrigation systems hissed and sputtered. The perfect image the HOA had worked so hard to preserve started unraveling in real time. The board scrambled. They issued frantic newsletters claiming temporary water disruptions due to scheduled maintenance. They tried to downplay it to save face, but the residents weren't buying it. Some of them started asking questions. Others came to me directly, wanting to know what had really happened. I showed them the documents, the inspection reports, and the photos of the well before and after it was filled with concrete. Their faces shifted from confusion to anger. Many had no idea the HOA had that kind of unchecked power. And once they realized this wasn't just about landscaping rules or mailbox colors, but about control over basic resources, they were furious. The HOA held an emergency meeting. For the first time, it was standing room only. People who had never attended before filled the room, demanding answers. The board tried to spin the narrative, claiming that my well was unsafe and unregulated. But that argument didn't hold when I presented certified test results, the original installation permits, and statements from multiple agencies confirming its legitimacy. The crowd turned on them. What had started as a quiet complaint from a single homeowner had exploded into a public reckoning. Reporters began to call. Local news picked up the story when they heard about the utility shutdown. A private homeowner's well being destroyed by a suburban HOA and the resulting shutdown of community water? It was exactly the kind of absurd, infuriating headline that grabbed attention. Cameras showed up at the gates. News vans parked outside the clubhouse. Now the HOA wasn't just facing legal action. They were facing public scrutiny, media pressure, and the loss of all credibility. Their carefully managed image was collapsing under the weight of their own arrogance. All it took was one phone call, a single, strategic call to the right agency backed by the right documentation. And suddenly, the power the HOA thought they had over everyone else was being stripped away. Not by vandalism, not by revenge, but by accountability. They had built their authority on silence and fear. They counted on no one challenging them. But I wasn't just defending my water. I was exposing a system that had gone unchecked for far too long. The damage had been done, but the aftermath revealed just how fragile the HOA's illusion of power really was. For years, they had operated with little resistance, enforcing rules through intimidation, levying fines for petty infractions, and rewriting bylaws to serve their own agendas. Most residents stayed quiet, afraid to lose access to amenities or simply too exhausted to deal with the bureaucracy. But when they filled my well with concrete and tried to sweep it under the rug, they underestimated the impact one act of aggression could have when the target wasn't afraid to fight back. Once the water was shut off and the media attention started to grow, the cracks in their foundation widened. Residents who had long felt oppressed began speaking up. Complaints about unfair treatment, ignored appeals, and arbitrary rule changes flooded the HOA's inbox. Board members who had once ruled the community with smug certainty now found themselves cornered at every meeting. Public opinion was no longer in their favor, and for the first time, they were forced to answer questions they couldn't spin their way out of. What made this different from all the other times was the paper trail. I had evidence, thorough, dated, and undeniable. Every permit, every inspection, every test result, every photograph and video from the day they trespassed and carried out the destruction was neatly compiled and sent to the relevant agencies. I didn't act on impulse. I acted with precision, and that's what exposed them for what they really were. A board of homeowners pretending to be a government, issuing punishments without process and hiding behind vague language and faux authority. The legal fallout was swift. Civil litigation was filed, not just by me, but by other residents emboldened by what had happened. Several class action complaints were formed, alleging mismanagement of funds, abuse of power, and violations of property rights. Insurance providers were alerted. The HOA's legal defense fund was quickly depleted. They had spent years collecting dues from residents for supposed community betterment, but now they were burning through that money to protect themselves from lawsuits that could have been avoided with a single ounce of common sense. The state utility regulators issued a formal citation, with fines attached for unauthorized interference with a registered water source. The county environmental office added further penalties for improper disposal of construction material into a water-bearing system. Even the health department weighed in, citing public health concerns over their careless handling of utility infrastructure. Each letter and notice added more weight to the case, and the board member silence became more telling than any statement they could issue. One of the most telling moments came when a longtime resident, an elderly man who had lived in the neighborhood since before the HOA existed, stood up at a public meeting and read from a deed document that predated the HOA's formation. It clearly outlined the rights of original property owners to maintain wells, outbuildings, and other self-sufficient systems. His voice shook with anger as he described how the HOA had tried to force him to remove his greenhouse water tanks years earlier. He had complied out of fear, but now, seeing how my case had unfolded, he realized he should have fought back then. His words struck a nerve with everyone in the room. Residents began demanding changes. Petitions were passed around calling for the immediate resignation of the board president and several senior members. A recall vote was initiated, supported by dozens of homeowners who had previously remained silent. It wasn't just about my well anymore. It was about accountability, transparency, and respect for individual rights. Things the HOA had abandoned long ago in pursuit of their picture-perfect, tightly controlled community model. New leadership candidates emerged, campaigning on platforms that prioritize communication, fairness, and a return to common-sense governance. People started attending meetings in record numbers. They showed up, asked hard questions, and refused to accept vague answers. The culture of fear was slowly being replaced with one of empowerment. Neighbors were no longer just residents. They were engaged citizens, determined to take back control of the community they actually lived in. What began as a single violation against my property had exposed an entire system built on unchecked authority. And now, the HOA was facing more than just fines or bad press. They were facing a reckoning. Their actions had been hidden behind years of policy language and closed-door decisions, but the spotlight was now firmly on them, and under that pressure, they were crumbling. They had operated as if they were immune to consequences, but they weren't. They had crossed a line that could no longer be ignored, and now the very foundation of their power was slipping out from beneath them.